Good morning, my name is Alan Goldring and I'm from Restore Albany, and this morning I'm coming to talk to you about Daniel, and in the series From Fear to Faith, and we're going to take a look at that. And you may look at the first 6 chapters of Daniel and think, where's the fear? Because everything he seems to do in those first 6 chapters turns to gold. Well, we'll be looking at chapter 1 and 2 and 4, 5 and 6, because in chapter 3, for some reason, which we don't know, Daniel is not there in the picture at all. Just his 3 friends, Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego. They end up in the fiery furnace, but Daniel is just not around. So we'll take a look first of all at chapter 1. And so just the other thing I need to mention is that there are 3 kings that Daniel is under during his time. First of all, there is Nebuchadnezzar, then there's Belshazzar, and then there is Darius, and they're the 3 kings. In chapter 1, you find that Nebuchadnezzar is there. Nebuchadnezzar is probably one of the greatest kings in the Old Testament. He comes from Babylon in the southern part of Iraq, as we have today. And he's gone all the way up, right the way through the Fertile Crescent and swept down through the Middle East. He's gone into Egypt, he's taken that, he's gone up to Turkey, modern day Turkey, and taken part of that. So that was the extent of his empire. As I say, he's probably one of the greatest kings that we know of in the Old Testament. In chapter 1, you find that that Nebuchadnezzar has taken Daniel and his 3 friends and removed them to Babylon, quite a distance around. And what he's trying to do, he's taken the upper class people from the kingdom of Judah, and he's taken both and their children as well. And Daniel and the 3 friends were probably children of people from the upper class. And the idea is he wants to take them, he wants to integrate them into his society and then train them up to be Babylonians. What he does, he gives them new names. The names actually contain the names of Babylonian gods, and because their own names contain the names of Jewish gods, and he wants to remove that and get them to become Babylonians. He trains them up into the science of trying to look at the stars and also to try to understand what dreams are as well. On top of that, he gives them food, again Babylonian food, and the food that he gives them is the food that the king has. And for some reason, Daniel believes that that food is wrong for them to have. We don't know what the reason was. It may be that the food had been offered to idols, but he thought this was wrong. So he goes to this chief steward, a person called Ashpenaz, and kind of does a deal with him. He said, do you mind if we just have something, if my friends and I have some food which is just very plain, like vegetables and water, something like that, and just have that for 10 days and see how we go. And that's what, and the agreement was enacted, and after 10 days it was found that Daniel and his 3 friends were fitter and better than all the other students that were there as well. And so they continued. And at the end of their period of time of training, Nebuchadnezzar did the kind of final exam on these 4 lads. And when he did this exam, he found that they were better than anybody else. Not just fitter, but also intellectually they were better as well. And Daniel was someone who was probably about 18 at this time. And I imagine as any 18-year-old in this kind of situation, he must have quite a bit of fear. And yet he was able to stand before Nebuchadnezzar and show and stand on his principles and not have that food. Let's go to the second chapter. Involves Nebuchadnezzar having a dream, and he wakes up and he says to calls his advisors, and wants his advisors to tell him what this dream meant. And the advisors said, well, you tell us what the dream was, and then we can interpret it for you. But whether Nebuchadnezzar was very wise or whether he really didn't know, but he said he didn't know what the dream was. And so the advisors were supposed to tell Nebuchadnezzar what the dream was and then interpret it. And they said to him, well, no one can do that. No one can know what the dream was without being in touch with the gods. And we're not in touch with the gods. And so that really infuriated Nebuchadnezzar. And he decided that he would get rid of the advisors. And there's no point in training up the students. So he decides to get rid of those as well. And so you can see the difficulty that Daniel and his three friends are in. So Daniel goes to the chief guard, a person called Arioch, and says to him, can I go and see the king? Because I believe I know someone who can tell the king what the dream was and what it means. And so he marches into the king and says, I have found a man, which he hasn't actually, because the king then turns to Daniel and says, can you tell me what the dream was? And he said, no. He said, but I do know someone who can. And he negotiates some time so that he can go and find out from God what that dream was. So he goes away, and the first thing he does actually is to go and talk to his three friends. And they have a prayer meeting. You know, I don't know what you're like, but when I get into difficulties or whatever, I tend to try and sort it out first. And then maybe once I found that I can't sort it out, then I turn to God. And really we ought to turn to God first. This is what Daniel does. Turn to God first. And I can remember in Restore a number of years ago, we had a series which was Pray First. And we should really be praying first. Pray first to God, and then we will find out really what God wants and what God has for us. We used to have a little, like a bracelet on, one of these elastic kind of bracelets, which reminded us throughout that course that we should be praying first. And that's what Daniel did. And as he prayed, he got what the dream was, and the answer went back to the king and said, your dream was about a statue. And it's got different metal. As it goes down, it's more valuable at the top. As it goes down, you are the top of that statue. You are the gold. And he goes down and describes the other parts of the statue, which in fact are the other empires that are going to come after Nebuchadnezzar. And Nebuchadnezzar was really pleased with them and what Daniel has said to him. And then we jump over chapter 3. We leave chapter 3 to one side, and we go on to chapter 4. And there in chapter 4, we find that Nebuchadnezzar, he has another dream. And he always seems to be having dreams. And he has another dream, and the dream that he has, he then asks for interpretation of that dream. And Daniel again comes and tells Nebuchadnezzar what the dream is. The dream was of a tree, and in that tree were birds, and underneath the tree were a lot of animals, and they were all sheltered under the tree. And Daniel said to Nebuchadnezzar, you are that tree. And as you look at the tree, eventually what happened, the tree was cut down, and then it was preserved. Bands were put around the stump, and they kept it. And eventually the tree grew again. And Daniel says to Nebuchadnezzar, you are that tree. You are in that tree. All the birds and all the animals underneath are all the kingdoms around which you have conquered. And they are really under your protection. But eventually you will lose that. And you will go down lose it all. But eventually you'll come back again. And he said, I wish I could be talking about somebody else other than you. Well, a year or so later, we find Nebuchadnezzar, whether he's thought about that, whether he's dismissed that or not, and he's walking along the walls of his city. The walls were thick enough, actually, for 3 chariots abreast to go down those walls. And as he's walking down the city walls, he's looking over the magnificent city. And he says, is not this Babylon that I have built by my glory and my power? Sounds a little bit like he's saying the Lord's Prayer, but to himself. And just as he finishes, suddenly he's struck down and he's on all fours. And his advisors take him to his palace and put him outside the palace. And there, outside the palace, he feeds on the grass outside the palace. People who have wanted to criticize Daniel, I've looked at this part, have said, have you ever heard of anybody eating grass? It just can't be true. You know, there is a documented account of somebody who suffered from what is called lycanthropy. It is a form of insanity. And this person was in a hospital ward in 1948 in the UK, and he fed and ate the grass outside the hospital ward. So it is something that is recorded to have happened in our history. And there was Nebuchadnezzar eating that grass as an animal. I don't know how long it lasted for, but it says eventually he looked up, and he looked up and realized what God was and what God has done. And he says this, he says, I, Nebuchadnezzar, raised my eyes towards heaven, and my sanity was restored. Then I praised the Most High. I honoured and glorified him who lives forever. His dominion is eternal. His kingdom endures from generation to generation. All the peoples of the earth are regarded as nothing. He does as he pleases with the powers of heaven and the peoples of the earth. No one can hold back his hand or say to him, what have you done? At the same time, that sanity, or my sanity, was restored. My honour and splendour were returned to me for the glory of my kingdom. My advisers and nobles sought me out, and I was restored to my throne and became even greater than before. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and exalt the glory of the King of heaven, just because everything he does is right and all his ways are just. And those who walk in pride, he is able to humble. Now, what he did was to look up. And so often when you're down and things are not going right, your focus becomes down, becomes on you and not on God. And we need to put that focus on God. We need to look up when we're down in that kind of situation. We focus and focus upon God himself. Let's move on to chapter 5. When you look at chapter 5, it's about Belshazzar. You may have heard about Belshazzar's feast, and Nebuchadnezzar has died, and his son Nabonidus was the next ruler of Babylon. But he then, because of a series of battles that he'd had with the Persians, then had gone into exile to the south of the city, and he left his son Belshazzar as the kind of prince regent of Babylon itself. And so he's described as a playboy prince, and what he decides to do is to have a party. He took some sacred cups. Nebuchadnezzar had taken these sacred cups out of the storeroom that he put him in Babylon, and he took these sacred cups and he decided to have a party with these sacred cups. And it's rather like that sacrilege really to God, and that's what he did. And he decided to have the party. We know from secular history that this was on the 12th of October, 539 BC. And on that day, what had happened is that the Persian Empire had surrounded the Babylon, and they had just won a battle, and they were now at the gates of Babylon. And when they were there, what they did was the Babylonian defenders were actually drunk, and they were looking down on the attackers, and they said to them, this city is so thick and so well defended, it will take you 3 years to be able to conquer this city. And which was probably true. And then let's go back to this party that Belshazzar was having. And there he was having his party, and suddenly on the wall there comes a hand, and it writes, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Parsin. And everyone goes panicky because what is this? And there's horror filled the room. And with all the commotion, into the room comes Nebuchadnezzar's grandmother. Or came into the room, Belshazzar's grandmother, which is Nebuchadnezzar's wife. And she says, there is a man in this kingdom who your grandfather used, and he knows the secrets of the Most High, and he will be able to tell you what this writing is. And so his son summons Daniel, comes to him and says, if you can tell me what that writing is, then I will make you third ruler of the kingdom, which people have found very strange. But of course, Nabonidus, his father, was the first ruler, even though he's in exile. He was the second ruler, so quite naturally the next person in line would have been Daniel, and he would have made him the third ruler of the kingdom. And so Daniel doesn't tell him initially what the wording meant. he just had a go at him. It basically told him his future, really, and told him that he should have listened to his grandfather. And there are people perhaps in our family who are people of God, and we really do need to listen to some of what they have to say, because it is really from the Lord. And so what he does, then Daniel turns to the interpretation of these words that are on the wall, and he says, "You have been found wanting, and you have been weighed in the balance. You've been found wanting, and your life will be taken from you tonight." Now, what actually happened was that the Persians who were around the wall, they had someone who was quite a bright spark, and he decided that what they could do, because the river Euphrates ran right the way through the city, the walls went down to the river, and he funneled off diverted the river at the north into a marsh. And when the level of the river dropped to below the walls, the Persian troops went in from the north and the south, and they were able then to conquer the city. And that night, Belshazzar lost his life. And then we go on to the third one, which is Daniel in the lion's den. And what has happened now is that the Persians have occupied the city, conquered the city. And the ruler, as I said, is Cyrus, but he appoints a sub-king, which is called Darius. And Darius has appointed Daniel as like the prime minister of the country. And there, what he does is he has other leaders as well, but these other leaders around him were people who were jealous, and they decided to have a plot to get rid of Daniel. And what they did was they realised that Daniel prayed 3 times a day, and they decided they based the plot around that. So they went to Darius and said to him, "Oh, Darius, live forever. And we've got this idea, if for 30 days everybody prays to you." It's a good idea, he thought, because it would unite the kingdom. Everybody would be praying to him. It certainly went to his ego, and so he agreed to it. And he signed the law, and there was the laws of the Medes and Persians that you couldn't change. You couldn't write an executive order and change it, but that was the situation there. And so what happened was that they knew that Daniel would be praying, and so Daniel opened up his windows looking at Jerusalem, and he prayed 3 times a day. I wonder how many times a day you pray. And there's a real lesson to us that we have a relationship with God, and so often we might only just pray once or twice. I'm not laying this down as a rule, but our relationship with God should be that there should be a consistent pray to God on certain things, and that's what that's what Daniel was doing. But he prayed 3 times a day. He was praying really that the children of Israel will go back to the promised land. And Jeremiah had said that after 70 years, if they pray to me, then they will go back. And he was following that, and therefore praying to God that would happen. And you probably know the story that Daniel was taken, and Darius was rather apologetic because he realised that he'd been conned into this, and Daniel was thrown into the lion's den, but God shut the mouths of the lion, and that Daniel was not harmed. And the king, after having a very sleepless night, came into that lion's den, had Daniel pulled up, and then the plotters thrown into the lion's den, and they were killed. So that's Daniel there, and it's a tremendous faith for Daniel. And Daniel has moved from maybe a frightened teenager right the way through all these experiences into someone who has a real faith. You know, it's very easy. Let me just read this. It's very easy to get the wrong impression from the book of Daniel. Someone has once said this: if he's not interpreting a king's dream, then he's watching a king go mad. If he's not reading some mysterious writing on the wall, then he's being thrown to the lions. If it seems that when he went to bed, he had marvelous dreams, and when he got up, he had visions, and he was bumping into angels all over the place. And you look at that, and I look at that, and say, my life has no comparison with this. The other thing is to think about is that Daniel was probably about the age of 90 when he was thrown into the lion's den. And so he lived something like 34,000 days. In the book of Daniel, Daniel is recorded about 5 days. So the question is, what did he do with the other 33,995 days? The answer is he just got up, went to work, ran the civil service, and then came home in the evening. He just did his normal daily routine in much the same way as you and I did. So he only had 5 days where something spectacular happened. Wonder if you're just going to have something put up, and I wonder who you think this is. It's a description of someone in the Bible. It says this: he is miserable, nibbling at bread, drinking water. He won't touch wine, won't eat meat and various other foods. He's depressed, unhappy and unkept, and he's been like this for 3 weeks. He's actually travelled 35 miles from his friends and from his countrymen, and now he's having this sort of experience. Who is it? And I once asked that in a church, and a number of people came up with various ideas. Someone said Elijah, someone said Job, which it could have been. In fact, what is strange is there could be quite a number of people who this would fit into the Bible. It is actually Daniel. If you look at Daniel chapter 10 and the first 4 verses, you find that this is a description of Daniel. There is a situation where people do have some marvelous experience, like Elijah on Mount Carmel, and then when he's threatened afterwards, suddenly he goes into a state of depression. And a number of Christians people have described it as the dark night of the soul. And people go through that kind of experience. And Daniel was no exception. He'd gone from fear to faith, and then down to fear again. And we see that he then goes up to faith again. And, each one of us probably have a desert which we go to. And Daniel had gone into a desert with all these things that were going on, and he'd gone away from God, and he was really depressed. He did the right thing to begin with. If you look at the first verse of chapter 10, you find that what he does is to pray, and he prays, and yet he doesn't get an answer to this prayer. And that makes things worse, doesn't it? When people do that, we pray, and it feels like heaven is just like solid still. Nothing is getting through to us. And so that made Daniel feel even more depressed in his situation. And eventually he realised, and it wasn't till later on, he realised that he was involved in a spiritual battle. And when we get involved with things with God in this situation, in the kind of thing that Daniel was involved in, maybe situations that we can be involved in, we find that we're involved in a spiritual warfare. And here's Daniel involved in this spiritual warfare, doesn't realise it until the end, doesn't realise it until an angel comes and reveals it to him. But he's involved in this spiritual warfare. An angel comes and he does a number of things. First of all, he lifts him up. Now, the worst thing is that if we're depressed, then we're kind of gone on our own like this, we sit down, and again, our focus becomes on ourselves. And then secondly, he says, God loves you. Don't be frightened. Fear not occurs something like 366 times in the Bible. That's one for each day of the week, and one for each day of the year, and one in case there is a leap year. And then he stand him up, and he stands him up. And we need to get up, and we need to do something. And then the other thing he does is the angel touched his lips. And if we're going to do anything for God, we need a touch of God on our lips, so that we can do things. And that's what the angel does for God. Let me just recap on some of the things that we have seen today. First of all, that Daniel, when he was an 18-year-old, decided that he ought to stand on his principles and not eat that king's food. And then when it came to the second incident, that he decided also to pray first with his friends and pray before he acted. And he prayed and asked for God to give him the interpretation and the dream itself. And then when we come on to chapter 4, we find that really we have Nebuchadnezzar. There's also somebody else who's gone from fear to faith. And there in chapter 4, we find that he looks up. He looks up at God. His focus becomes on God, and his focus is away from himself. And he realizes who God is. And then fourthly, at Belshazzar's feast, there is Daniel declaring what God has told him to do and to say. And lastly, in the last chapter or chapter 6 of Daniel, there he is praying 3 times a day. And it's an example to us of the amount of our relationship with the Lord, that we should be constantly praying to him. Where did Daniel go from here? Well, we know he went back to faith because you look at the last 2 chapters of the book of Daniel, and there are prophecies about the last days. Now, I know it's controversial, but yet he come back to God, and God was using him in a tremendous way. Thank you very much, and may God bless you all.